History of the human race has thousands of different conquests across ages, regions, and cultures, but it is difficult to find one that played such a decisive role in the future events as the conquest of Greece by the Roman Republic, as its effects echoed through the millennia. Welcome to our channel. Today, we will cover the first Roman involvement in the Greek affairs, 4 Macedonian Wars, Seleucid War, Aetolian War, and Achaean War. These long videos take forever to make, so please kindly like this video, share and subscribe to the channel. Let's dive in. The year is 231 BC and the Mediterranean world is a land of continuous warfare and political upheaval. Just 10 years before, the burgeoning power of the Roman Republic had defeated Carthage in the First Punic War, establishing naval dominance on the sea. In the east, the Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon, Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire vie for dominance over their border territories. Sandwiched between these greater polities are a number of smaller states, such as Pergamon and the nominally independent Greek city-states. This is the world of the late 3rd century BC, but soon a series of conflicts between two rising powers, Rome and Macedon, will change the fate of the region forever. The region which was Illyria, currently modern Albania and Dalmatia, was regarded in the mid to late 3rd century as a thoroughly barbarian region, only half civilized by contact with its Greek and Macedonian neighbors. Though contact with the Greek world had led to a degree of urbanization in the south and along the coast, the region in a political sense was still made up of many small tribal chieftains. The population of Illyria had been regarded since their initial encounters as turbulent and warlike by the more traditionally civilized peoples who came to know them. From time to time, one of the many Illyrian tribes would gain a temporary hegemony over most of the others, and in the 230s, this was the Ardii. Ruled by their energetic king Agron, they had forged a union of not just their own Illyrian peoples, but also prominent figures such as Demetrius, the Greek lord of Pharos. Coinciding with the rise of this new Illyrian power was the collapse of Epirus, whose once formidable strength had waned and whose monarchy fell. Taking advantage of this weakness, the Illyrians invaded and eventually managed to seize Epirote territory far south of the traditional border, climaxing with the seizure of Flamininus, the wealthiest city of the kingdom. Despite these successes, however, Agron perished soon after and was succeeded nominally by his son. In reality, it was his wife Tuta who wielded true power, quickly being appointed regent for her stepson. Her ascension did not stop Illyrian belligerence, and in her reign, piracy increasingly became a major problem in the Mediterranean. Seizures of more southerly territories in Epirus had allowed the establishment of more staging points from which brigands could sail. This had been occurring for a long time already, but the increasing scale of the problem, the increasingly loud complaints of Roman merchants, and the economic impact of piracy on the Republic prompted the Senate to act. Uncharacteristically peacefully for the notoriously bellicose Romans, the initial senatorial reaction in 230 BC was not to send in the legions, but instead to send a diplomatic embassy of 2 brothers to investigate the situation. In the typically harsh style of Roman diplomacy, the Coruncanius brothers protested to Tuta about the increasing piracy and demanded that it cease immediately. The demand was not negotiable, and the Illyrians would have a chance to comply peacefully, otherwise it would be war. Tuta refused this demand, either because of her inability to control the actions of her decentralized tribal allies, or because she simply did not wish to bend to Roman demands. Whatever the case, this did not please the Romans, a situation made even worse by the murder of a Roman envoy, possibly by Tuta herself in the midst of the anger of the meeting, or on the journey home by those very pirates that the embassy had been dispatched to stop. While the death of the Roman envoy was the immediate trigger for war, the expansion of the Ardii tribe's power over the region was a deeper geopolitical cause. Rome did not want any powerful rival in the Adriatic. Late in the campaigning season of 229 BC, a massive Roman force of 22,000 men and 200 ships bore down on the Illyrians. Though details of the short campaign are unknown, it is known that the Roman expedition was a complete success from north to south. Tuta's appointed governor of the recently conquered island of Corcyra, Demetrius of Pharos, went over to the Roman side almost immediately, while the Queen Regent's forces were defeated in the field. By spring of 228 BC, Tuta had been forced into a peace treaty with the Romans, breaking her kingdom into weaker segments and forbidding ventures of piracy into the southern Adriatic Sea. the Romans withdrew their troops and left behind only their amicitia, or friendship, a benign-sounding term which would soon apparently become anything but that. In essence, being a friend of Rome included the de facto conditions of becoming an informal client state. A primary beneficiary of the peace of 228 BC was the defector Demetrius of Pharos, who was granted a small independent principality of his own, sandwiched between the remnant of the Ardeaean kingdom and the Greek cities. Despite these gains, under Roman auspices, it seems that the ambitious Demetrius was not content to remain in his small kingdom, and shortly after the peace was finalized, he married Trituta, the Ardeaean king's biological mother. By becoming the young boy's formal regent in this act, Demetrius of Pharos effectively recreated the powerful Illyrian kingdom abolished by Rome in the First Illyrian War. Even more boldly, he began to launch pillaging raids into the territory of Roman allied tribes. It could be that Demetrius was testing the water, and, due to the lack of any Roman response, he believed they either could not or did not wish to intervene. This was an illusion, as the Romans were instead occupied by the Roman-Gallic War of 226–222 BC, and it would prove to be a fatal illusion for Demetrius. Further trying his luck, Demetrius set out with 90 light galleys in the summer of 220 BC on a grand piracy expedition, ravaging cities around the Adriatic Sea in blatant violation of the treaty 8 years before. He had finally gone too far, and Rome now decided that their former ally Demetrius now posed the same threat to Roman interests that Teuta had, and moreover wished to punish their friend for betraying them and not acting like a friend should. The disproportionately massive Roman action, which began in 219 BC, was probably motivated by the Republic's desire to swiftly and decisively conclude the Illyrian situation before a new war with Carthage began, as it seemed like it might. Demetrius' strategy was to hold the fortresses of Demalum and Pharos itself, but the Romans took the former in only 7 days, while a rash sortie by Demetrius lost him Pharos. The man himself evaded capture because he had placed a squadron of hidden galleys in a secret cove, fleeing to them when the battle was lost. On these ships he fled to the south, abandoning his family to Roman imprisonment and his men to death at Roman hands. Not long after, Demetrius reached the Adriatic port town of Actium, where the fleet of a great Hellenistic king, Philip V of Macedon, was anchored. When he arrived, the king welcomed Demetrius heartily, and he quickly became a key advisor. Meanwhile, the Romans once again withdrew all of their soldiers from the region, leaving no military presence. They once again left only their friendship behind, but had demonstrated to the Iomad, great Macedonian kingdom to the south, that they had the will to intervene in the east. Before continuing, we need to reverse time for a moment and briefly examine the history of Macedon after its would-be conqueror, Pyrrhus of Epirus, died in Argos. The victor in that battle, Antigonus II Gonatas, was firmly in control of Macedon by 272 BC and had also established hegemony over the Greek city-states. Having gained the loyalty of his turbulent homeland, Antigonus II did his best to maintain it. He raised a great sacred mound to honour the graves of the Argead house, reorganised the provincial system to increase its efficiency, and was vigilant in keeping Macedonian coinage a high-quality currency. Making good use of Macedon's depleted resources and funds, Antigonus focused on access and mobility, extensively utilising the Antigonid fleet and the great naval fortresses of Demetrius, Chalcis and Corinth to ferry troops to strategic locations. An Athenian-led, Ptolemaic-supported attempt at shaking off Macedonian domination failed in the Cremonidean War from 268 to 261 BC. Though Antigonus managed to quell this revolt, crucial fortresses such as the Acrocorinth were lost during his reign, which finally ended in 239 BC with his death. His successor, Demetrius II, ruled for a relatively uneventful decade, during which Macedon's situation weakened ever further, and he died in 229 BC. The late king's own son, Philip IV, was only a child at the time of his father's death, and Macedon could not afford a child ruler in such a perilous time. A regent was clearly required for the time being, and a distant Antigonid relation was chosen for the task, Antigonus Doson. As one of the lesser-known but more highly competent Macedonian kings during the 3rd century BC, Antigonus Doson began to raise the young Philip as his own son, and at the same time energetically set to campaigning in order to beat back Macedon's enemies. He first marched north and expelled the Illyrians from the kingdom, and then struck south and crushed the Aetolian League. After securing his borders, Antigonus proceeded to renounce all Macedonian claims south of the Thermopylae Pass, wisely hoping to consolidate and stabilize the situation in Macedon itself. The response of the army was to demand that Antigonus accept the title of king. While he did this, Philip V's rights to the throne were not usurped or taken away, and Antigonus swiftly appointed him the official heir. After another series of victories, which included the first ever seizure of Sparta by a foreign army, Antigonus III Doson perished in 221 BC, leaving behind a resurgent, stable and increasingly powerful Macedon to Philip V, who now ascended to the throne. Soon after taking the throne, Philip V and the Macedonian hegemony was once again challenged by the Aetolian League and its allies during the social war of 220-217 BC, who believed Philip was too young to be an effective ruler. It was during this war that Demetrius of Pharos arrived at the royal court. Cataclysmic events in the west now began to attract wider attention in the Mediterranean world. The Second Punic War had broken out in 218 BC, and the Carthaginian general Hannibal successfully crossed the Alps to invade Italy. There, he had already defeated one Roman field army at the Trebia River, and in June of 217 BC, he crushed another at Lake Trasimene in Etruria. Hearing of these massive Roman defeats, Philip V now began to consider expansion in the west at the expense of an apparently dying Roman Republic. This new direction was encouraged by Demetrius of Pharos, who, after being expelled from his Adriatic dominion by Rome, now argued that Philip should end the social war, gain control of the Illyrian coast, and attack Italy himself. Accepting the military status quo and ending the war in Greece at Naupactus, Philip then drove the Illyrians from Macedon once again, and in the winter of 217 BC had a fleet of 100 light warships constructed. In summer of 216 BC, the king made his first attempt at securing Illyria's coastal region, but fled home upon hearing news of an approaching Roman fleet. The decisive Roman defeat at Cannae was another crucial moment, as it prompted Philip to send envoys to Hannibal asking for a formal alliance. He no doubt wanted to join the winning side and make gains at Roman expense. The story goes that the envoy, Xenophanes, was captured by a Roman praetor on his way to speak with Hannibal, but managed to talk his way to freedom by stating that he was instead there to make peace with Rome. However, the unfortunate Xenophanes was captured again on his way back to Macedon, with the formal treaty with Hannibal in his possession. It was in this manner that the Romans learned of that new threat that faced them. Following the conclusion of the Punic Macedonian Treaty, Philip aggressed further with new attacks against coastal Illyria, attacking Corcyra in 215 BC. This intensified in 214 BC when a major offensive began. Philip's land army marched north into Illyria through Epirus, while 120 Macedonian galleys sailed up the Straits of Otranto. In this campaign, Philip swiftly seized Oricum and besieged Apollonia, who called to Rome for help. With a strengthened Adriatic fleet, the Roman commander Laevinus now crossed the sea with 55 heavy Roman warships, lifted the siege of Apollonia and drove the Macedonians away from Oricum, two crucial ports which could have been used as a staging point for an attack on Italy. After these victories, Laevinus wintered his fleet in Oricum, while Philip burned his ships and retreated overland to Macedon. Having been blocked at sea, the Macedonian king attacked instead over the Pindus Mountains, making significant gains in 213 and 212 BC. The inland Daceretes, Partheni, and Atintani tribal settlements fell to him, without a significant Roman response. The Republic did not have the land troops to spare for a side venture into the eastern Adriatic, as they were still fighting against Hannibal. This situation changed during the later part of 212 BC, when Philip was once again able to reach the Adriatic. Having battered his way through the land to the coast, he managed to seize the coastal fortress of Lissus, another possible staging point. It became clear to the Romans that this eastern threat could no longer be ignored. Neutralizing Philip at this point was beyond Roman military power alone, due to the Carthaginian War, so the Senate began to use diplomacy as a weapon. Each commander knew that their counterpart was close, but the reduced vision of the fog caused disorientation in the two armies. Philip set off marching in the morning, sending a group of fast-moving skirmishers to the ridge's summit in order to get a better view. As they reached the top, 10 Roman cavalry squadrons and 1,000 velites emerged from the murk and attacked. Both scouting contingents suffered some casualties, but both also managed to get word to their commanders of what was happening on the Cynoscephalae ridge. Flamininus reacted swiftly, sending 2,000 Aetolian infantry and 500 cavalry to the ridge as reinforcements. Their arrival swung the balance in favour of the Romans, and the Antigonid skirmishing force slowly withdrew to the top of the ridge, sending frantic messengers to Philip for help. Even though the king did not wish to join battle in such unfavourable terrain, he was not going to abandon his scouting party, and sent 3,500 cavalry and mercenary infantry to reinforce it. This tipped the scales, and the new reinforcements now pushed the Romans back down the slope. Polybius tells us that they almost routed completely, but this was prevented by skillful skirmishing and harassment by the Aetolian allies. At this moment in the morning, the sun began to burn away the fog, and with the battle visible on the slope visible to the Romans, Flamininus and his entire army could see their forces losing. Witnessing the apparent defeat of the Roman skirmishing force demoralized the main Roman army, but their commander handled the situation appropriately. After ordering his entire army to form up in battle order, Flamininus addressed his troops at the base of the slope. He used all of the oratory skills that a prominent politician would have, professing to them that you fought these men before, and you've beaten them before. As this happened, the triumphant Antigonid skirmishers sent jubilant messages back to Philip, urging the king to attack while momentum was on their side. So the order was given for the army to deploy in battle order. Due to the unprepared nature of the encounter battle, half of Philip's troops were still foraging, and he could only form up half of his forces, ordering his general Nicanor to follow up when the others had returned. Having formed the right side of his line, the king marched at the head of his phalanx up the slope, hoping to rush and rout the Romans with the weight of his phalanx, which was screened by the Agema peltasts and flanked on the right wing by cavalry. On the other side of the ridge, Flamininus advanced only with the left side of his line, to reinforce the battle which was still going on between the two scouting parties. The heavy infantry's presence in the fight now caused the Macedonians to retreat back up the slope. Many were killed, while others fled back towards their king. Two half-armies were now marching up each side of the slope directly towards one another, but were still completely unaware that the other was present, due to the fact that a slight fog still obscured sound and sight. It was because of this that the Roman left may not have seen Philip's 8,000-strong contingent cresting the hill in front of them as they climbed, but now both armies came into view of one another. The phalangists quickly organised into a double-depth formation, lowered their sarissas, and charged down the slope at the unprepared Romans. The remnants of Flamininus' scouting force barely managed to form up before the phalangists hit them. Metal pike heads clashed against the heavy Roman shields, but the crushing momentum of the downhill charging and double-depth phalanx quickly began to force the legionaries back. The Antigonid and Roman cavalry clashed on the wing, and the light infantry skirmished with one another, but the main clash was in the centre. Though the Roman left fought bravely and stubbornly did not rout under the pressure, it was slowly but surely being chewed up by the bristling pike wall. The encounter battle had started well for Philip. It seemed like it was only going to get better when Nicanor's larger contingent began to crest the ridge on the king's left flank in a rushed marching formation. Despite his best attempts at rallying the beleaguered troops on his left from behind the line, Flamininus was being pushed back ever closer to the Roman camp. Realising his left would soon collapse under the weight of the phalanx, the Philhellene commander wheeled his horse and galloped over to the unengaged Roman right, which was now screened by the war elephants. Upon arriving, Flamininus ordered his forces on this side of the battlefield to charge at the disorganised men under Nicanor's command, most of whom were either arriving or still had not formed up. Phalangists, the core of Philip's army, were almost useless when not deployed rigidly, and the Romans now crushed them. Many Macedonian soldiers were killed outright, but many more ran away and were chased by the legionaries. It appeared, though, the battle was in balance. Philip had triumphed on the Roman left, but Flamininus had crushed Nicanor. However, an unnamed Roman tribune, who must have possessed immense respect among the troops, now managed to halt 20 maniples, or around 2,500 of the troops on the right wing, probably mostly made up of veteran triarii. Realising that things were not going well on the Roman left wing, the unnamed military tribune marched his contingent of disciplined troops across the ridge and then struck the victorious phalanx of Philip from the rear. At the same time, The inspired and angry legionaries who had suffered for hours under the Macedonian attack renewed their assault. This intuitive maneuver caused the inflexible phalanx to fragment, and many of its phalangists were killed. Philip rode up and down the line in a vain attempt to rally his soldiers, but quickly realised it was hopeless and galloped off the battlefield. As the Romans were busy butchering the remaining enemy troops, a particularly terrible slaughter occurred. A group of Macedonian phalangists performed the traditional gesture of surrender, raising their pikes directly to the sky. However, the furious legionaries charged in and killed them all anyway. The battle was over, and the legion had triumphed over Alexander's phalanx. The Romans only lost around 700 dead, mostly on their left, which had bravely stood their ground under the attack. Antigonid casualties were catastrophic, with 8,000 dead and another 5,000 captured. Humiliating peace terms were imposed on Philip at the subsequent conference at Tempe. He had to evacuate all of Greece, including Thessaly, and give up conquest he had gained in Asia Minor and Thrace. A large war indemnity was demanded, his navy was destroyed, and his son Demetrius was sent to Rome as a hostage. Finally, and most chafing, proud Philip would become a client king of Rome, essentially a puppet. This war broke any viable attempts at Macedonian revival, but it would not stop them trying. After the peace conference at Tempe had been finalised, Titus Quinctius Flamininus decided to prove definitively that it was Rome who would be the true saviour of Greece. During the Isthmian Games of spring 196 BC, Flamininus took to the speaker's platform, declaring that Senate, General and Consul would leave the Greeks free, ungarrisoned, untaxed and autonomous after over a century of Macedonian rule. Erupting with jubilation at their apparent liberation, Flamininus was mobbed at the festivities and was showered with honours from the grateful city-states. In Rome, the Senate decreed 5 days of thanksgiving for the Cynoscephalae victory. His dignitas had never been higher. Also, at the Games, Flamininus was met by a party of envoys who had come at the behest of King Antiochus III in order to congratulate the consul on his victory and to assure the Romans of their liege's peaceful intentions. Whatever reply they were hoping to receive, they instead were met with cold sternness and demands. Antiochus was to keep away from the Greek cities, withdraw his garrisons from those he had already seized, and was ordered not to attempt a crossing into Greece. Now, we need to follow the admonished envoys back east, where they informed their sovereign, Antiochus III, of the Roman demands. While Rome and Macedon were fighting at Cynoscephalae, Antiochus, who was also known as the Great, was concluding the Fifth Syrian War against his traditional rival, the Ptolemies of Egypt. By the last year of the conflict, the realm that was created by the Diadochi of Alexander Seleucus became the biggest empire of its time, taking over Caria, Lycia, Cilicia, Coele Syria, and other Asiatic holdings of the Ptolemies. So, it is not a surprise that Antiochus, who was considered one of the best commanders of the era, was angry at the Roman intrusion into Greek affairs and the rebuke of his diplomats, and was confident in his strength. In this period, Antiochus started creating a fleet off the coast of southern Asia Minor, probably planning to invade Egypt. However, his fleet's movement to the west prompted a reaction from Rhodes. The small island wasn't strong enough to compete with the Seleucids on land, but had a dominant navy, so Antiochus promised to leave Halicarnassus to the Rhodians and not create a base on Samos in exchange for free passage of his navy through Rhodian waters. With a war avoided, in 196 BC, Antiochus took over the remainder of the Ptolemaic holdings in Asia Minor, including the crucial Ephesus. He then decided to conquer the territory of the weakened Macedon and took Abydos and Ilium, which meant that he now had a perfect location to cross the Hellespont. The citizens of the nearby Lampsacus were worried that they were the next and, in a sign of how things had changed in the last decade, sent envoys to the Romans asking for protection. At that point in time, the cities in the area were under Thracian control, and Antiochus obviously knew that restoring Hellenic rule would be seen favourably by the Greeks. So, he traversed the Hellespont, first taking Chersonesus and then besieging Maditos. The fall of the latter forced other cities to submit, and Antiochus increased his influence by rebuilding the city of Lysimachia, which effectively bottled up the Gallipoli peninsula. This might have impressed some of the Greeks, but the Romans weren't amused, deciding that Antiochus's takeover of Gallipoli was a breach of the ultimatum. Roman politics was dominated by two men, the victor of Cynoscephalae, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, and the hero of the war against Carthage, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. The latter wanted to move troops into Greece immediately, but the peace party led by Flamininus prevailed, so the Republic sent a diplomatic mission to Lysimachia, demanding that Antiochus leave Europe and return the Ptolemies their lost territories in Asia Minor. However, by the time it arrived, Antiochus had already agreed on peace with Egypt by marrying his daughter to the 10-year-old Ptolemy V. He claimed that as Ptolemy was his son-in-law, he was not going to fight him anymore. As negotiations continued, news arrived that the Ptolemaic king was dead. Antiochus immediately broke off talks and rushed to Ephesus and from there to Antioch, confirming the Roman suspicions that the Seleucids wanted even more territory. We don't have all the details, but it is known that the king attempted to launch an invasion of Cyprus, but the expedition ended in failure, either due to a storm. This famous location had seen numerous last stands before and after April 191 BC, as it was a natural choke point, defended by Mount Calidromus and Mount Tychius from the southwest, and the waters of the Malian Gulf from the northeast. Still, as Leonidas and Xerxes discovered 300 years before, this seemingly ideal defensive position had a fatal flaw. A small army could have bottlenecked a much larger force in the passage, but the mountains had numerous paths, making it possible to outflank the defenders. Both armies were culturally steeped in Greek history and mythos, and so obviously knew of this. With a few thousand Aetolians left to guard the crucial town of Heraclea, Antiochus had around 12,000 footmen and only 500 horsemen. As the Roman cavalry outnumbered their counterparts 4-1, the Seleucids had to fight at the narrow passage to avoid being outflanked. The king sent 2 groups of Aetolians, 1,000 hoplites apiece, to block off the most prominent mountain paths. He then built a wall covering the gate, placing a few catapults and ballistae on top. His skirmishers were positioned on the high ground to the left of the passage in order to send their missiles against the advancing Romans, while his phalangites formed up in front of the walls with the peltasts ahead of them. Similarly, the Romans had 2 thraes of their troops present, with the rest defending Thessaly and blockading Heraclea. Glabrio knew that he couldn't capture the passage against a phalanx, but still had to attack at the narrow choke point and tie up the Seleucid forces. 2 groups under Cato and Flaccus, each 2,000 legionaries strong, were sent to take the mountain passes. According to some sources, the Roman camp was raided by the nearby Aetolians before the battle, so Glabrio was forced to leave his cavalry and a group of infantry to defend it. Sources depicting the battle are somewhat conflicted. We know that Flaccus was ordered to take the pass at Mount Tychius during the night. There are authors who suggest that this unit lost its way during the march, while others claim that the Romans met Aetolians, but the hoplites were steadfast and the legionaries weren't able to break through, losing dozens of troops and falling back. Cato's onslaught against the Aetolians at Mount Calidromus was more successful. Apparently, the Romans caught some of the Aetolians asleep, and their first strike killed many. But soon, the hoplites managed to form a line across the pass, and neither side had an advantage. Simultaneously, the main Roman force attacked head-on. The volleys of the skirmishers and peltasts did a certain amount of damage, but the disciplined Romans locked their shields and continued moving forward, even despite the losses caused by the field artillery. Seeing that the Romans were getting close, Antiochus ordered his peltasts to fall back, while his pikemen moved forward, forming a phalanx. That is where the Romans suffered most of their casualties, as the legionaries weren't able to reach the phalangites, and it was impossible for them to outflank the foe. Slowly but surely the phalanx pushed the legion back. However, by the early morning, the forces of Cato started to gain the upper hand near Calidromus, as he outnumbered the Aetolians 4-1 and was able to rotate fresh troops into the fray. Eventually, the Romans broke the hoplite line and sent it fleeing in terror. Shortly, both groups were on the plain, with the legionaries killing their foes in pursuit. The phalanx learned that its rear was now in danger, and even though the king made brave attempts to stop them, fled to the camp in order to form another formation. Still, Cato's detachment entered the camp before the Seleucids and the main body of the Romans shortly after, so the phalangites failed to get into formation. It was now every man for himself. Antiochus abandoned his forces with his cavalry, and more than 10,000 Seleucids and Aetolians were either killed or taken captive. Livy claims that the Romans lost 200 men, but this number is probably understated. After finishing off the survivors, the Romans took a day to rest, and then turned their attention against Heraclea, a formidable fortress, with its south protected by the river Asopos, and its west by Mount Oeta, and a citadel on low hills. The fortress was relatively modest in size, so a small Aetolian garrison was able to man the whole wall. At the same time, the walls were short, which meant that the Romans weren't able to use their decisive numerical superiority. Glabrio sent a message to the leader of the garrison, Democritus, demanding they surrender, but this was refused, so the Romans prepared for a siege and started constructing battering rams. When the siege began, the legionaries assaulted the walls with rams and ladders, but the narrowness of the front didn't allow them to overwhelm the Aetolians, and the latter sallied out, burning some of the rams and shoving the enemy back with their spears. The first assault failed. However, the Romans had more troops, so fresh troops were sent forth and the walls were attacked on the next day. The garrison didn't have this luxury, which meant that each subsequent assault tired them even more. This continued for 23 days, but eventually Glabrio devised a plan. His soldiers were ordered to return to the camp, making it look like there would be no attack. This made the exhausted Aetolians complacent, and they vacated the walls to sleep in the houses. Late at night, a group of legionaries was ordered to attack a portion of the walls and make as much noise as possible. Glabrio also commanded his legate, Tiberius Sempronius, to move his contingent to another sector of the fortifications. The noise woke up the Aetolians, and they started running, reaching the walls in time to rebuke the Romans, but the other group was already scaling the ramparts, using the ladders. Seeing that, the Aetolians vacated their positions and retreated to the citadel. The Roman commander allowed his soldiers to loot the city, but after it was done, began devising plans to take the citadel. His engineers started building siege engines on the nearby hill to bombard the defenders, while the rest of the troops formed up surrounding them. The Aetolians had almost no food left, but most importantly, no way to counter the catapults, so Democritus capitulated. We don't have the numbers, but it is possible that the Romans lost more troops taking Heraclea than during the Battle of Thermopylae. After the defeat at Thermopylae, the king retreated to Chalcis. There was a possibility he could defend the island of Euboea and keep it as a foothold, but it was scrapped when Glabrio moved south, forcing the Boeotian League to submit, and the Roman navy commanded by Aulus Atilius destroyed the Seleucid supply convoy around Andros. So, the king started his journey back to Asia in May of 191 BC. There were many reasons Antiochus was defeated in Greece, but it boils down to these key factors. Roman diplomacy and logistics were superior, while the majority of Greeks didn't buy into the notion that the Seleucid king was liberating them from the Romans, and even his Aetolian allies didn't commit all of their forces. Glabrio did not have a force big enough to follow the king across the sea, and he had to concentrate against the Aetolians. He moved north again and took Lamia, putting even more pressure on the League. The latter sent messengers to Antiochus in June, asking for him to return or send money so they could continue fighting. Money wasn't a problem for the wealthy king, and so the envoys returned to Greece with funds. Despite the fact that the money helped the Aetolians regain their resolve, the Seleucid cause in Greece was getting weaker. The small garrisons of Demetrius and Elis were forced to evacuate, with Elis and Messenia falling into Achaean control, while Glabrio besieged Naupactos, deep inside Aetolian territory, in July. The siege continued for 2 months, but then Flamininus arrived and yet again negotiated a ceasefire. Aetolian messengers and Flamininus then travelled to Rome in the hopes of signing a peace treaty, while Glabrio's army went to its winter quarters. Meanwhile, events were transpiring on the sea. Seleucid Admiral Polyxenidas had around 40 warships and 60 smaller vessels, and he was ordered by Antiochus to watch out for a possible naval invasion, while the king himself moved with 30,000 troops to Lysimachia to defend his gains in Thrace. The details are scarce, but by August, Polyxenidas had around 200 ships, 70 of them bigger, warships, probably quadriremes. The new Roman admiral in the area was the praetor Gaius Livius Salinator. He took command of the navy, which had been in the docks ever since the Second Punic Wars, and started sailing to unite with Attilius's navy. As this was before the ceasefire was agreed upon, Livius raided the Aetolian-controlled Kephallonia and Zakynthos along the way, putting even more pressure on the League. In August he reached Attica, and his fleet now had more than 100 vessels, 80 of them large warships. Both sides knew what they had to do. The Romans needed to unite with their Pergamene and Rhodian allies to have equal numbers, while Polyxenidas' best hope to win was to prevent that from happening and take on each of the enemies separately. In September, the Seleucid Navarch learned that the Aetolians had repositioned their navy to Elaea, and that Livius was to the north of Delos, and he decided to move himself to Phocaea. However, at some point he lost the Roman fleet, and assumed that it turned south to join the Rhodians, so he went for Samos. This was a mistake, as a week or so later the Romans coalesced with the Pergamene navy commanded by King Eumenes II, bringing their total to 160 ships. The allies started chasing Polixenides and caught him off the coast of Chios at a place called Sissus. In a short battle, the Seleucid fleet lost 23 ships and was forced to retreat. Even defeated, Polixenides was undeterred and sailed fast towards Samos, where he managed to surprise the Rhodian fleet and destroy 24 vessels. However, the effects of this victory were small. The allied fleet was on its way, and another navy from Rhodes, under Eudorus, was converging on Polixenides from the south, so he took the only remaining safe route to Ephesus. Attacking a navy in a dock protected by land artillery is always folly, so the Romans just blockaded Polixenides for now. At the same time, the Republic was planning to invade Asia Minor in 190 BC. The new Roman commander for 190 BC was the consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of the famous Scipio Africanus, who accompanied him as legate. Crossing into Asia with around 30,000 Roman and allied troops, they joined forces with Eumenes II of Pergamon, whose loyalty had been unwavering. The combined army advanced south while the Roman fleet secured the coast. Antiochus III, now desperate to stop the invasion, gathered a massive army of over 70,000 men, drawn from across his vast empire. This included the elite silver-shield phalanx, cataphract heavy cavalry, light auxiliaries from as far as Arabia and India, scythed chariots, and 54 war elephants. Confident in his numbers, the king chose a flat plain near Magnesia ad Sipylum for the decisive battle, perfect for his phalanx and cavalry. The Seleucid deployment was impressive. On the right wing, Antiochus placed his elite cataphracts and companion cavalry, commanded by himself. The centre held the massive phalanx in deep formation, screened by light infantry and the terrifying scythe chariots. The left wing featured lighter cavalry, Galatian infantry, and more auxiliaries, with the elephants positioned in intervals behind the line to support charges or cover retreats. Skirmishers and archers filled the gaps. Facing them, the Roman Pergamene army was outnumbered but superbly coordinated. Lucius Scipio formed the legions in the standard triplex aces on the right, with war elephants in front. The centre was held by allied Greek infantry. On the left, Eumenes commanded the crucial Pergamene cavalry, supported by Achaean infantry, Trallan and Cretan archers, and slingers. The battle opened with a thunderous charge of Seleucid scythed chariots against the Roman left. Eumenes, anticipating this, ordered his light troops forward. A storm of javelins, arrows, and slingstones spooked the horses, causing many chariots to veer out of control, crashing into their own lines or fleeing harmlessly. The chariot attack, meant to disrupt the Romans, failed spectacularly. Seeing the chaos, Eumenes launched his cavalry charge against the weakened Seleucid left. The Pergamene horsemen smashed through the lighter enemy cavalry, routing them quickly. Pursuing relentlessly, they then wheeled inward, striking the exposed flank of the Seleucid phalanx and auxiliaries. At the same time, Roman skirmishers and archers targeted the elephants, panicking the beasts with noise and missiles. The maddened elephants stampeded backward, trampling the Seleucid light infantry and creating even more disorder in the centre and left. On the other wing, Antiochus personally led his cataphracts in a devastating charge against the Roman left and centre. His heavy cavalry broke through the legion's flank, driving deep toward the Roman camp and scattering allied troops. For a moment, victory seemed within reach as Antiochus pursued the fleeing Romans. But the king's success on the right proved fatal elsewhere, with the Seleucid left and centre collapsing under Eumenes' attack, and the elephant rout, the phalanx, now unsupported, began to buckle. The Roman legions in the centre advanced steadily, exploiting the gaps. Legionaries slipped into the disrupted formation, using their gladii to deadly effect in close quarters, just as they had at Cynoscephalae. Realising too late that his overextension on the right had doomed the army, Antiochus galloped back, but the battle was lost. The Seleucid forces disintegrated, thousands were cut down in the pursuit, others drowned, crossing the nearby river. Antiochus lost over 50,000 men killed or captured, along with most of his elephants and baggage. Roman and Pergamene losses were minimal, fewer than 400 dead. The great Seleucid army, one of the largest fielded since Alexander, had been annihilated. Antiochus fled east to Sardis, then Apamea, his dreams of Western Empire shattered. With no force left to oppose them, the Romans and Eumenes received submissions from cities across Asia Minor. In 189 BC, Gnaeus Manlius Vulso would campaign against the Galatians, further demonstrating Roman power, but the war was effectively over. Peace negotiations began immediately, but the final treaty was concluded in 188 BC at Apamea. The terms were crushing. Antiochus surrendered all territory in Asia Minor west of the Taurus Mountains, effectively ending Seleucid presence in the region. He paid a massive indemnity of 15,000 talents over 12 years, surrendered his remaining elephants and all but 10 warships, and provided hostages, including his son, the future Antiochus IV. Pergamon and Rhodes were the big winners. Eumenes gained vast territories including Lydia and Phrygia, cementing his kingdom as the premier power in Western Asia Minor. Rhodes received Lycia and Caria. Rome took no direct territory, but emerged as the unquestioned arbiter of the Hellenistic East. The Peace of Apamea marked the end of the Seleucid Empire as a Mediterranean superpower. Antiochus III, once called the Great, spent his remaining years raising funds for the indemnity, dying in 187 BC during a temple raid in the east. His empire would never again challenge Rome directly. In 189 BC, Rome sent 2 new consuls to Greece and Asia Minor to finish the wars. The first, Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, not only made sure that the Seleucids fulfilled the terms of the treaty, but also went to war with Galatia. The Galatian War, that the Romans won handily, is beyond the scope of this video, but it was remarkable for 2 reasons. It showed that Rome could now easily invade Asia Minor, and was the first time a Roman general declared war without the approval of the Senate, and this set a precedent that would lead to the downfall of the Republic. While all that was happening in the east, the ceasefire between Rome and Aetolia ended in early 189 BC, and using the absence of the Roman armies, the Aetolians attacked Philip of Macedon and easily pushed him out of Thessaly. However, soon the second consul Marcus Fulvius Nobilior arrived. Supported by the Epirotes, he besieged Ambracia, and that forced the Aetolian army to retreat from Macedon, as they were worried about being outflanked. Although Ambracia managed to resist for months, it was clear to the League that it won't be able to fight on without the Seleucids. So using Athenian mediation, they started peace negotiations with Rome. Again, the demands were heavy, but the Aetolians had no other choice but to accept. The League lost half of its members and territory, and also was prohibited from having a foreign policy without Rome's approval. Although technically independent, the League stopped being a major player after this treaty. In 184 BC, the second son of Philip the Faes, Demetrius, went on a return visit to Rome. After Cynoscephalae, Demetrius was the boy taken as a hostage by the Romans, and he had emerged from that experience a committed Romanophile. This only intensified when the Senate decided to give the sympathetic Demetrius their official support, and he returned to Macedon in 184 BC with a very different attitude to his father. Macedonian court politics during this period were especially fierce. While the Seleucid conflict was raging, the royal court in Pella had become bitterly divided over the Roman issue, and it was almost as if 2 courts existed at once. One of these circles consisted of those advisors and high-born men who favoured peace and accommodation with Rome, and was gathered around Demetrius. On the other hand, another group formed around the duo of Philip V and his eldest son Perseus, and was packed with firebrands who advocated resistance against the invaders from the west. Both factions began an underhand war of propaganda against one another, using rumour and intrigue as weapons. Perseus's mother was routinely slandered as being of low birth and a one-time concubine. Therefore, it was implied that Perseus was less legitimate than Demetrius, who was the younger sibling. Demetrius realised that, despite his friendliness with Rome, Perseus had influence with his father, and became certain that his days were numbered. He made a mistake at this point, confiding his fears to one of his father's courtiers named Didas, telling him he planned to flee to Rome. This man promptly told Philip, who also discovered a letter speaking of Demetrius's lust for the throne. Despite it probably being a forgery, Didas poisoned Demetrius in the winter of 181 BC on the order of Philip. This was the only dynastic murder of the entire Antigonid dynasty, and its outcome was a surge in hostility between Rome and Macedon. The situation destabilized even further in 179 BC, when after over 4 decades of rule, Philip V passed away in Amphipolis while preparing for a campaign against the Thracians. With his rival Demetrius also dead, Perseus became the king of Macedon. He did what new Antigonid kings always had to, immediately reaffirming old friendships and building new ones. Rivals to the throne were eliminated, and in this new Rome-dominated world, it was necessary to send emissaries to the Senate, hoping for their official recognition of Perseus's accession to the throne. Reluctantly, this was granted. On the diplomatic front, Perseus also entered into many alliances and diplomatic arrangements with the various Greek city-states, making no secret of Macedon's continuing interest in Greece. Naturally, this was to the great annoyance of the Romans. Furthermore, to the east, Perseus astutely married his sister to Perseus II of Bithynia, and the king himself married the daughter of Seleucid monarch Seleucus IV. So in addition to playing nice with the Greeks, Perseus was also swiftly gaining a network of useful allies in Asia Minor, much to the increasing anger of Pergamon, which was excluded from these affairs. Its king, Eumenes II, played his kingdom's usual part as a sycophantic informant to their Roman lords in the west. Initial insistences and warnings by Eumenes to the Roman Senate fell on receptive ears, primarily because they wished to keep their hegemony over Greece. In 175 and 174 BC, repeated Roman warnings to Perseus refused to cow the young king. Moreover, he performed a grand spectacle of marching his entire army on a peaceful parade through Delphi, the sacred centre of the Greek world. The message was clear: he was the protector of the Greeks, not the Romans. Increasingly urgent embassies from Pergamon began to beseech the Roman Senate for help, and in early 172 BC, Eumenes himself came to plead his case. He not only repeated previous claims that Perseus had simply inherited his father's preparations and resolution for war against Rome, but also claimed that the peace since 189 BC had allowed Macedon to fully recover its strength. Finally, the Pergamene king played his trump card, stating to the Romans that I felt it would be utterly disgraceful if I failed to reach Italy to warn you before he arrived here with his army. Cynically playing on the tradition post-Hannibalic fear of invasions in their homeland, Eumenes got his way. The subsequent diplomatic pressure and investigations into Perseus's conduct would turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the king could see the Senate was intent on destroying him. Therefore, he was required to take steps to be ready for them. It was his only choice. Philip V may have been the aggressor in the previous war, but now the Romans were hungry for conflict with Perseus. Roman envoys sent to negotiate a truce with the Macedonian king then boasted of deceiving him into thinking there was even a chance of peace. In fact, the truce was purely a measure in order to gain more time for the Romans to prepare for war, as they refitted a fleet of old ships and embarked a powerful army from Brundisium to Apollonia. This Roman new cunning of deception and underhanded tactics was not met with approval from all quarters. More traditionalist senators remembered a time when the Romans treated their enemies as honoured and honourable men. It turned out that such methods were no way to run an empire. Whatever the case, the Roman Senate had decided that the only way to maintain their position in Greece was to have no equals at all. The Antigonid monarchy had to disappear, and the Third Macedonian War began. Roman consul Publius Licinius Crassus crossed the Adriatic in the late summer of 171 BC in order to take control of the legions there. At the same time, Eumenes of Pergamon arrived at Chalcis with his fleet, disembarking with 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry of his own. At sea, the Romans had unquestioned mastery of the Aegean Sea, so they dismissed the allied vessels, only retaining Eumenes' assistance. They only wanted the help of those allies who they knew were most loyal and were hesitant to be indebted to friends such as the Rhodians, who would probably want peacetime gains for their wartime performance. Meanwhile, Perseus advanced south into Thessaly, ravaging lands on the way, and encamped just to the south of Mount Ossa, having taken command of the army his father had begun to rebuild. At the same time, Licinius secured the Greek west coast and advanced into Thessaly via Athemania. When the consul arrived at the Greek city of Larissa, he encamped just outside the town by a hill called Callinicus, where he was reinforced by Eumenes' Pergamene forces. As the Macedonians had grown bolder due to their opposed ravaging of the Thessalian countryside, Perseus decided to match them toward the Roman camp, erecting their own around 5 miles away. After resting his army for the night, Perseus drew up his line into formation and marched his cavalry as well as the light infantry forwards. The phalangists stayed behind in reserve. Odrysian king Cotys IV commanded the Thracian cavalry and interspersed light infantry on the left flank, while Macedonian horsemen and Cretan skirmishers on the right were led by Medon of Beroea. Both wings were flanked by the king's cavalry and auxiliary infantry from various foreign nations, while the centre was made up of Perseus's elite agema, the sacred cavalry and 400 slingers in front. Opposite the Macedonians, Licinius's field army formed up its heavy infantry safely behind their camp's ramparts, sending their own cavalry and skirmishers out to meet the enemy. The Roman right wing, commanded by Caius Licinius Crassus, consisted of the Italian equites with velites scattered between them, while the left under Valerius Laevinus commanded the Greek allied cavalry and infantry on the left. In the centre, Quintus Mutius led a force of Gauls, Thessalians and other volunteer cavalry. Missile fire from javelins and sling stones opened the battle, causing light casualties on both sides before Cotys's Thracian horsemen charged. They fought like wild beasts, according to Livy, and swiftly smashed through the Roman right-wing cavalry. At the same time, Perseus and his elite agema troops broke the Roman centre. Believing he could turn the battle into a decisive engagement, Perseus was about to order his phalanx into the battle, but was persuaded not to take such a risk by Euander the Cretan. Thanking Euander for his wise counsel and taking the victory where he could, Perseus withdrew back to his camp. 200 Roman cavalry and 2,000 infantry had died, and only 60 of Perseus's men had died. Further skirmishes followed this battle, but the campaigning season of 171 BC was essentially over. The Romans proceeded to occupy themselves by brutally razing the anti-Roman cities in Boeotia. Haliartus was completely annihilated after a short siege. 2,500 men were sold into slavery, and the town remained desolate for decades afterwards. This type of increasingly notorious Roman savagery in Greece, along with Perseus's victory at Callinicus, made the Macedonian king appear to be a champion of the Greeks. Most who believed this were still too frightened of Rome to take action, but the Molossians of Epirus did defect. One setback after another appeared to be striking the Romans in this conflict, and this was only compounded when Perseus launched a successful raid on the Roman fleet at Aureus, destroying ships and spoiling grain supplies. Despite these Republican failures and Macedonian successes, Perseus knew that he could not grind Rome to victory. He needed a decisive victory in battle. By the end of 169 BC, Rome's position in Greece appeared precarious, and only the arrival of the new consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, in 168 BC breathed fresh life into the floundering Roman cause in Greece. The first-century Greek biographer Plutarch informs us that this scion of the prominent Aemilii patrician family did not even want to be consul at this point, as he had already failed during his run for a second term. However, his previous victories against the Lusitani and Inguani tribes had not been forgotten. The Senate believed him to be the best candidate on their list to bring order to Greece once again. Eventually, overwhelmed by the constant requests for him to stand for office, Aemilius was elected and immediately given the Macedonian command. Plutarch also tells us that after his election as consul for 168 BC, Aemilius went home to find his daughter in distress. Naturally, the father asked what was the matter. His daughter, embracing Aemilius with sad tears in her eyes, told the consul that their little dog was dead. That dog's name, so the story goes, was Perseus. Possibly apocryphal stories aside, the force which Aemilius took command of was large, 2 especially strengthened Roman and allied legions, totaling around 22,000 legionary heavy infantry. The allied legions now comprised various peoples who, until recently, had been long-standing enemies of Rome, such as the Etruscans and Samnites. Supporting the heavy troops were thousands more light infantry, including velites, Pergamene troops and Greek allies. 4,000 cavalry also mounted up in the Roman army, including 1,000 of the infamous Numidian cavalry under their prince Missagenes. With the North African troops also came 22 imposing war elephants. Perseus, meanwhile, had around 44,000 foot and 4,000 horse on his side of the field. 21,000 of the infantry comprised the fearsome phalangists with their sarissa pikes and phalanx formation, which reached a mile in length. Supporting this moving wall of pikes were light troops, auxiliaries such as the Thracian javelinmen and Illyrian archers. After advancing into Thessaly in the summer of 168 BC, Aemilius marched south, meeting Perseus at the foot of Mount Olympus, where he had drawn up his army in a highly defensible position. The Antigonids were dug in on the west bank of the Elpius River, just east of the mountain, and had easy access to the nearby town of Dium. With typical Roman grit, it seems like the fact that Perseus had such a position did not bother the legionaries and, eager to redeem their honour after Callinicus, urged Aemilius to attack immediately. As a retort, Aemilius told his men to mind their place and underlined the fact that they would fight when and how he told them to. In order to dislodge Perseus from his defensive position, Aemilius assigned a subordinate, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, to launch a feint towards the sea with 3,500 allied infantry and 5,000 legionaries. Under the cover of darkness, he would march through an unguarded pass in order to surprise Perseus. This might have gotten the jump on Macedon's king, but a Cretan auxiliary in the Roman army defected and informed his fellow Greeks of the Roman plan. Reacting immediately to this alarming news, Perseus sent a general named Milo with 2,000 Macedonians and 10,000 Thracian mercenaries to oppose the Roman passage. Though Nasica hadn't expected this resistance, upon his arrival in the pass, he ordered a charge. The mountain fighting in the narrow defiles and passages was bloody and brutal, and Nasica himself supposedly came toe-to-toe with a fearsome Thracian soldier, slaying him with the pilum javelin. Rome's legionaries doggedly stabbed and slashed their way through the mountain pass, routing the Macedonians, who then fled back to the main army and informed Perseus of the defeat. Realizing that the loss of this mountain pass would render his position vulnerable, the king immediately decamped and marched away from the mountain. While Aemilius moved through the mountain pass and emerged onto the foothills around Mount Olacrus, Perseus drew up his army behind a river on the plain below, near the town of Pydna. The hand-picked field of battle was fantastic for the Macedonian phalanx, and Perseus's position atop a small ridge and behind the river gave him a distinct advantage. Aemilius knew this, and so did not advance just yet, remaining in his camp on the hills. The general's officers, especially Nasica, quickly became restless and wanted to attack immediately. Stoically, Aemilius smiled and advised Nasica not to be so hasty, informing him of the folly of attacking a phalanx on such ground. The Romans did not waste their time, and constructed a marching camp for that night. When darkness had fallen and the soldiers were resting around the various campfires and sleeping in their tents, the moon suddenly grew dark, its white colour shifting to a dull red. The superstitious men in the Macedonian camp were deeply affected and surprised by what was apparently a bad omen. A moon, which seemed to bleed red, had Zeus abandoned them. At the same time, the equally pious Romans did not react as badly. Why was this? A military tribune of the Roman army, Caius Sulpicius Gallus, was a learned astronomer. The day before, he approached his general and gained his permission to assemble the soldiers, informing them that such an event, that we know as a lunar eclipse, would occur on the following night. He urged the soldiers not to see such a thing as an ill omen, as it was a regular, predictable, and natural thing. Therefore, when the eclipse did occur, the Roman soldiers simply followed their commander in offering sacrifices to the Greek gods, promising to hold games in Heracles' honour. The gestures worked, and the Roman soldiers' morale was unaffected. With both leaders engaging one another in a dangerous staring contest, it would take a spark for the flames to ignite. Said spark came in the form of a misbehaving mule. In order to fill up jugs of water for the thirsty Roman soldiers who wore heavy armour, a small train of mules was led down to a stream below the foothills by lighter troops. Like the stubborn creatures they are, one of the parched pack animals supposedly scented the water and bolted away from its handlers. The water-gatherers ran after it and discovered that a group of Perseus's Thracian troops were doing the same. Moreover, the enemy was attempting to steal their mule. The irritated, frustrated, and scorching Roman soldiers were not going to give up that mule, and a brawl broke out over the animal. Runners on both sides went to get help, while the mule probably just ran off. Perseus saw an opportunity to draw the Romans down from the uneven foothills of Mount Olocrus and marched his entire army out of the camp and straight towards the brawl at the stream. The Romans could see what was going on from their camp, and they were furious, demanding angrily to be allowed to march out and fight. Aemilius risked mutiny if he refused, and so gave the signal to form up. After only allowing his legions a brief amount of time to form up, he swiftly commanded the advance, aiming to save the men at the stream. At that moment, the marching phalangists were given the order to lower their pikes. In unison, the intent. First 5 ranks held their sarissai horizontally, and the ranks behind kept them at a 45-degree angle. Then they advanced. Against the barely armoured Roman light troops, whose main job was to skirmish at a distance, the phalangists met almost no serious resistance, and simply tore through the enemy ranks, trampling and spearing hundreds in a brutal advance. The Roman velites and auxiliaries fled back toward their forming legions, buying precious time. As the Macedonian phalanx crested the small ridge and advanced across the uneven plain, the ground began to tell a different story. The terrain around Pydna was not the flat open field ideal for the phalanx. It was broken by small hills, dips and streams that disrupted the perfect alignment the formation required. Aemilius Paulus, observing from the rear, saw the opportunity immediately. The phalanx, advancing too eagerly, began to lose cohesion as different sections moved at varying speeds over the uneven ground. Gaps appeared between the files, and the once impenetrable wall of sarissai became ragged. The Roman commander ordered his legions forward, not in a reckless charge, but in a controlled advance designed to exploit these fractures. The war elephants, positioned on the Roman left, were unleashed first. 22 massive beasts thundered toward the Macedonian left wing, where Perseus had placed his Thracian and mercenary infantry. The sight and sound of the charging elephants caused immediate panic. The Thracians broke and fled, exposing the flank of the phalanx. Numidian cavalry under Misagenes poured through the gap, cutting down fleeing mercenaries and threatening to roll up the entire Macedonian line. In the centre, the Roman legions engaged the disrupted phalanx. Where the Macedonian formation held steady, the long sarissai kept the legionaries at bay, inflicting heavy casualties. But wherever gaps had opened, the flexible maniples flowed into the breaches. The gladius, short, sharp, and perfect for close combat, proved devastating. Legionaries slipped past the useless lower ranks of pikes and hacked at the unarmoured legs and groins of the phalangists. The phalanx, designed to push forward as a single unit, could not turn or manoeuvre effectively on broken ground. Perseus, fighting in the front ranks with his elite agema, saw the battle slipping away. He attempted to rally his men, riding along the line and shouting encouragement, but the collapse on his left and the growing chaos in the centre proved too much. When reports reached him that his right wing was also crumbling under pressure from Paulus's Hastati and Principes, the king made the fateful decision to flee. With his sacred squadron of cavalry, Perseus galloped from the field toward the safety of Pydna town. The flight of the king triggered a general collapse. The Macedonian phalanx, already fragmented, disintegrated completely. Thousands threw down their heavy sarissai and tried to surrender by raising their arms. But the enraged Romans, remembering years of bitter warfare, showed little mercy. The pursuit was merciless. Legionaries and Numidian cavalry hunted down fleeing phalangists across the plain and into the sea itself, where many drowned, trying to escape on makeshift rafts. By nightfall, the Battle of Pydna was over. Perseus's great army had been annihilated. 20,000 to 25,000 Macedonians lay dead, and another 11,000 were captured. Roman losses were remarkably light, fewer than 1,000, with most falling in the initial clash against the intact phalanx. Perseus himself was captured a few days later on the island of Samothrace, where he had sought sanctuary. Brought to Rome in chains, the last king of Macedon was paraded in Aemilius Paulus's triumph, before living out his days in comfortable but permanent captivity at Alba Fucens. The victory at Pydna in June 168 BC marked the effective end of the Antigonid kingdom. The Senate divided Macedon into 4 nominally independent republics, forbidden to trade or intermarry with one another, and required to pay tribute to Rome. The proud Macedonian monarchy, heir to Alexander the Great, was no more. But this was not quite the end of Macedonian resistance. In 149 BC, a man named Andriscus, claiming to be a son of Perseus, raised a rebellion in Macedon. Proclaiming himself Philip VI, he quickly gained support, among a population chafing under Roman-imposed restrictions and taxation. Andriscus defeated a Roman Praetorian army in 149 BC and briefly restored a unified Macedonian kingdom. Rome responded decisively. In 148 BC, the consul Quintus Caecilius Metellus, later called Macedonicus, was sent east with a full consular army. At the Second Battle of Pydna, Metellus crushed Andriscus's forces. The pretender was captured, paraded in Metellus' triumph, and executed. This time Rome took no chances. Macedon was annexed outright as a Roman province in 148 BC, the first of the great Hellenistic kingdoms to suffer this fate. A permanent Roman governor and garrison would now rule from Thessalonica. While Macedon fell, tensions simmered in southern Greece. The Achaean League, once Rome's ally against Macedon and Antiochus, had grown increasingly resentful of Roman high-handedness. Roman envoys repeatedly humiliated Achaean assemblies, and the League began to assert its independence more boldly. Sparta, long a reluctant member, attempted to secede, leading to war within the League. In 149 BC, as Andriscus rose in the north, the Achaeans also defied Rome by attacking Sparta. Roman warnings were ignored. In 147 BC, the Senate dispatched the consul Lucius Mummius with an army to restore order. The Achaean general Diaeus raised a desperate army of 14,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, many of them freed slaves armed with whatever weapons were available. The final confrontation came in 146 BC at the Battle of Corinth. The Achaean forces, poorly equipped and outnumbered, were annihilated by Mummius's legions near the isthmus. Diaeus fled and later committed suicide. Corinth, symbol of Greek wealth and culture, was singled out for exemplary punishment. Mummius's soldiers were given free rein to loot the city for days. Priceless works of art were shipped to Rome, and on the consul's orders, Corinth was systematically destroyed, walls razed, buildings burned, and the site left desolate. The surviving population was sold into slavery. The destruction of Corinth in 146 BC, deliberate, total, and public, sent a chilling message across the Greek world. Resistance to Rome would be met with annihilation. In the same year, 146 BC, Carthage was also destroyed at the end of the Third Punic War. These twin catastrophes marked a turning point. The Hellenistic world, once a mosaic of proud kingdoms and free city-states, was now firmly under Roman hegemony. Greece was reorganized, the Achaean League dissolved, many cities placed under direct Roman supervision, and a governor of Macedon now oversaw much of the mainland. Yet Rome still maintained the fiction of Greek freedom for compliant states. Cities that had remained loyal were rewarded with autonomy under Roman protection. Over time, this evolved into full provincial status. Achaea became a province around 27 BC under Augustus. The conquest of Greece was not a single dramatic campaign, but a gradual, often reluctant process spanning over 80 years, from the First Illyrian War in 229 BC to the sack of Corinth in 146 BC. Rome had not initially sought dominion over the Greek East. Intervention began as a defensive response to piracy, then as a counter to Macedonian ambitions during the Hannibalic War, and finally as a deliberate policy to eliminate any potential rival. The flexible Manipular legion had repeatedly proven superior to the Macedonian phalanx on anything but perfect terrain. Roman diplomacy, divide and rule, rewarding allies and punishing resisters, proved equally effective. And when diplomacy failed, Roman ruthlessness ensured compliance. The cultural impact was profound and lasting. Greece did not vanish, rather it conquered its conqueror culturally. Educated Romans adopted Greek literature, philosophy, art, and architecture. The Roman elite spoke Greek, collected Greek statues, and hired Greek tutors. As Horace later wrote, Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit. Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror. By 146 BC, the eastern Mediterranean was effectively a Roman lake. The great Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt alone surviving as a client, were now surrounded and overshadowed. Rome stood poised to inherit the entire legacy of Alexander's empire. This long, complex series of wars transformed the Roman Republic from an Italian power into a Mediterranean superpower. But the wealth, prestige, and internal strains that came with empire would, in time, contribute to the very forces that would tear the Republic apart. Thus ended the independence of ancient Greece, not with a single cataclysmic battle, but through a gradual, inexorable process that left Rome as the undisputed master of the classical world.